Allora, un paio d'anni fa, in un momento di scambio abbastanza, un acuto scambio boettiano, Ulrich Obrist mi mandò un'immagine di una cartolina che aveva ritrovato nel suo archivio, appena ritrovato nel suo archivio. L'aveva ricevuta da Douglas Gordon, l'artista inglese che molti di voi conosceranno, e la cartolina ritraeva l'immagine del planisfero al contrario, veniva appunto dall'Australia, così che l'Australia in qualche modo acquisiva una posizione con questo ribaltamento più centrale, un po' più preeminente rispetto al sud in cui è normalmente relegata, se così possiamo dire. Ecco, sul retro di quella cartolina Gordon aveva scritto "Boetti is Messiah", Boetti è il Messia, visto che siamo sulla santificazione. Ecco, questo per dire comunque intanto del ruolo, ovviamente, stiamo parlando di primissimi anni 90, del ruolo di Obrist come un altro dei traghettatori, se vogliamo, come Corrado, ma in un contesto più internazionale della pratica, e ce lo dirà lui stesso, di Boetti. Abbiamo un'intervista fatta da Michele Robecchi a Londra qualche giorno fa, e mi fa piacere dire che secondo la legge del contrappasso, dopo centinaia e centinaia di interviste fatte da Obrist agli altri, abbiamo Obrist intervistato.
How did you first meet
Switzerland, growing up as a kid?
Yes, I mean, to begin with the beginning, I started when I was a teenager, when I was like 17. Yeah. I started to visit artists. Already when I was 12, 13, 14, I started to visit lots of shows in Switzerland. Obviously, Switzerland, growing up as a kid was an amazing context to see shows. It was the time of Artissima in Zurich, Jean-Christophe Armani Basel. And that was really the beginning somehow for me to see all these shows. At a certain moment, when I was 17, 18, there was a kind of an urgency to meet artists. And one of the first studio visits was Peter Fischli and David Weiss, and it was a very magical moment. It was the moment when they were doing the way things go, and the studio was a chain reaction. And I was obviously meeting these great artists, and it was an epiphany, so to say. It was really, I was always saying, I was born in May '68 in Zurich, and I was kind of reborn a second time in May, sort of 17 years later, when I met Fischli Weiss in Zurich, because it's really then that I knew and I wanted to spend my life, working with artists. It wasn't clear then exactly how, but I wanted to work with artists. And Fischli Weiss told me about Boetti, and he said that he's one of their great heroes. And so the idea was born because our school, our lyceum, our school made a trip actually to Rome, and they suggested I should just, ring up Alighiero and see him. And that was the first encounter. I went next to the Pantheon. I think it was Via Pantheon. Yeah. It was next to the Pantheon, was the studio, and it was my first conversation. Somehow, I always felt that this conversation was life-changing in many different ways. It was kind of like almost, I knew I wanted to work with artists, I didn't really know how. Right. And he explained to me that he felt, that Alighiero felt that as an artist, he was somehow always, very limited in terms of the possibilities of the art world would offer. There would be, museum shows, gallery shows, sometimes public commissions, art fairs, biennales, and there would be all these other things he wanted to do. And it was somehow interesting that, he was really saying that that's the thing a young curator should do. Think about unrealized projects of artists. What does an artist want to do and cannot do within the parameters of the existing, art work. That was somehow the beginning. And so I then said, but what is your big unrealized project? And he basically mentioned two. He said that he always wanted to do a project where actually he would organize, one could almost say, curate or organize an entire airplane, on an airline throughout a year. Right. And the only thing somehow which had happened was some end of the year thing with Alitalia, and he really wasn't satisfied. So he said, find me an airline. That was really the mission. And the second project is that he said, when it was the beginning of fax, and it's interesting because, Alighiero was very often working with A4. There are these famous drawings with A4, there are the letters he sent, which is A4. A4 played a big role. There's this whole thing also with the photocopy machine. He made all these books with the photocopy machine. And obviously he was very fascinated by the A4 of the fax and this idea of global dialogue, instant transmission. So he said the second unrealized project was a kind of an agencia fax. So the idea would be that we would produce content every day, like almost like an exhibition. Artists would do pages and they could be faxed to a certain number of recipients. And that's obviously pre-email, digital technology, but it was this idea that there could actually be a sort of a planetary, immediate kind of channel.
Right.
And sadly, the second one remained unrealized. I never managed to pull off the Agencia fax. It was because by the time it would have been possible, fax became obsolete, and somehow that remained unrealized. However, we did do the Celi all'alta quota, high speed, because when I met Joseph Artner the year after meeting Alighiero, and we started the conversations about how to actually do a project in an airline that we went to see Austrian Airlines, and another 2 or 3 years later actually that happened in Vienna, and we had with Alighiero these skies at high speed, so puzzles were produced throughout the year, and you find these puzzles today all over the world because tens of thousands of puzzles were disseminated. It was really a planetary exhibition. Yeah, so I mean, one of the things which was interesting is that after this first, encounter with Alighiero, obviously for me as a teenager, it was an incredible impression. It was this amazing day where we experienced so many things and saw his studio, the Pantheon, Schifano studio, his astrologer, had the tarot cards. It somehow was one of the most magical days in my life. So I was on a night train, on the way back to Switzerland, and I was thinking very hard. And I think really that for me was somehow a moment of epiphany, because I was thinking, I mean, on the one hand, I was thinking I should ask more artists about their unrealized projects. It was the beginning of my whole research and making an archive of unrealized projects. I suppose it was also the beginning of really more making conversations with artists more systematic. And also this idea that conversation with artists could not be just for conversation's sake, but it might produce reality. I mean, he basically, said, what's the utility of your work? Your work has to have a utility for us. So I think in some kind of way, I think it's not only true for me, I think for many people who encountered Alighiero, he was an amazing, mentor, he was a teacher, he triggered something in people which otherwise wouldn't have triggered, and it really was transformative. And I remember, I mean, I was on this night train, I couldn't sleep, my head was completely, thinking, and I was all the time thinking, what could I do? And obviously I had the feeling before that everything had been done, and I was under the impression that maybe it's difficult to find, something new to be done, and I think, Boetti gave me this courage that it actually is possible, and there's everything still has to be done, and it has only just begun, and I was full of energy, and there was also an enormous transmission of energy. I mean, it was somehow, for me, a beginning, and it was probably the day where my curatorial work had started, so I was kind of, reborn in the studio of Fischli Weiss, and then born again in the studio of Alighiero Boetti, in Rome. And I think one of the things which is also important about Boetti is this idea when he says, don't become a boring curator, and he said, try to invent new formats. And I mean, that's something which I've been thinking ever since every day. I mean, it's something which comes to my mind every morning. I think, Boetti said new formats, it cannot be routine, it cannot be repetition. In dialogue with artists, it's about finding new formats, and that's true for exhibitions, that every exhibition, I mean, is an attempt somehow to find, a new format, and at some point, it's also important to go beyond exhibitions and see how we can maybe find new formats with other things and explore these new formats. And it's also the idea about how we can actually invent a new format, how to do a conference. And the sort of whole idea of encyclopedia also. I mean, Athanasius Kirchner obviously was probably the last person who wanted to say, that he knows everything, and obviously we face an impossibility of knowing everything. But this sort of immense curiosity Boetti had for everything, I think is something, I feel very close to.
So it was very, very instrumental in helping you define your practice.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was a trigger, and sometimes I think it's important that you can read for years, you can study for years, you can, build up a lot of momentum and research, but then there's this one conversation which frees you. I mean, and that's what I meant before. It's really like somebody throws you into the water, and then you just swim, and from then on kind of moves. And I think also this idea of him, I mean, inventing, new structures, like the One Hotel, was for me very inspiring. I was thinking, the One Hotel, maybe, was very much a trigger also for my hotel exhibition, where I invited 60 artists to exhibit in the Hotel Count and Palace in '93 in Paris, and this little room became a hotel exhibition. So it was a catalyst, a trigger for many things.
Many projects to come.
So yeah, I talk about Alighiero Boetti every day. I mean, in all the interviews, in all the conversations, I've dedicated many of my projects to the memory of Alighiero, many of my books.
Another thing that I wanted to ask is that a lot of Boetti's work was about time. And do you think his work kind of influenced your relationship with time?
I knew I needed to deliver, and I needed to produce reality. But somehow it marked an end of the first period where I just investigated and researched and spoke to artists, and I realized that, you know, I need to be a utility, I need to be useful. He made me aware, and I thought, you know, obviously to realize this unrealized project would be the biggest utility, you know, for art, and it became somehow an idea of curating. And he also said, don't become a boring curator. I will never forget that. He sort of said, he repeated it several times. He says, you know, don't become a boring curator. He also sent me a postcard where he says, you know, dear Hans, velocity quasi zero. So obviously, you know, receiving this postcard from him, he could only accelerate. It was also a beginning of, you know, seeing time differently. And I mean, one of the things I think which was key is just, I think, Jean Rouge once told me, you know, whatever we do, we kind of need immense courage, because otherwise we never do anything. And I think the main thing with Boetti for me as a teenager to meet him, it was sort of a transmission of courage, because I felt, you know, his courage, it just, you know, was an instruction somehow, was an encouragement to do it, to just start working. And somehow also, in a way which, I mean, he, I think, really anticipated globalization, because at the time, I mean, I started to do my first kitchen show at that time, and we also did this exhibition in the Hotel Carlton Palace, where actually Alighiero participated, and he participated with a postcard, which was the postcard of his hotel. I'm trying to find it. And I remember we discussed this, and I also spoke about Edouard Glissant, and I mean, it's very fascinating that he would mention Glissant and the idea of Edouard Glissant here, the one hotel.
Okay. Oh yeah, yeah.
And basically the idea of Edouard Glissant, and then Edouard Glissant later became a friend of mine, became someone I spoke to a lot. And it was really Alighiero Boetti who for the first time told me about this idea of how we could engage with globalization, because obviously it was inevitable that there would be a very strong, it wouldn't be the first phase of globalization, it would be a very strong globalization. And he always said we need to engage with it in a way which doesn't annihilate difference, but which does produce difference. And so that is what Glissant would define as mondialité, and that became somehow the mantra for me for all exhibitions. And I mean, it led to a lot of shows. One thing we always dedicated to Alighiero, because he was very much at the origin of this project, was this Do It. Do It is an exhibition which is mostly constituted by instructions and how-to manuals and recipes. It's like a recipe book. It's like a recipe book for art, and we came up with Potansky and Lavier to do this show, very much inspired by Alighiero's kind of do-it-yourself idea. So more than 100 artists gave algorithms or instructions, or you know, do-it-yourself manuals, and it became an exhibition which could travel without the object somehow. And I was also fascinated by Alighiero as a writer, because I think one of the things which is not talked of a lot, or talked about a lot, is Alighiero's incredible writing. And actually, when Caspar Koenig and I did the first book together, it's the Jahresend 38, it was Salam on the cover, we invited Boetti to participate, and he contributed an amazing text, actually, from today to tomorrow, and maybe we can quickly check here an extract. Page 58. We brought together here also Brulli-Douavre and Boetti, they later collaborated. It's Da Oggi al Domani, from today to tomorrow, and it's a text really about 20 years of his work, and 20 years of his research, and 20 years of his immense curiosity. And I mean, besides his writing, there is also his titles. I think one of the things I always found incredible, I mean, every day I remember Alighiero Boetti's title. I think his titles are among the most powerful titles there are. Da Oggi al Domani is just one. We have Niente da vedere, niente da nascondere, no? Nothing to see, nothing to hide. We have Avere fame di mente, to be hungry for wind, translation. And so on. I mean, there is just an infinite number of great titles. So that, you know, collaboration with the writing was another chapter.
What was Boetti's position and profile in the art world at the time when you met him?
I mean, he was very much, I think Boetti was always an artist, and it wasn't by coincidence that, you know, officially Weiss would talk about him.
Yeah,
many other artists talk about him. He was incredibly appreciated by other artists and had an immense influence on other artists. But I think he very much, at that time, you know, he had exhibitions, but it was not that he was recognized as this incredible visionary who anticipated so many things. I mean, I think that happens now more and more, because there are so many younger artists who connect to him.
Yeah, actually, I was about to ask you, do you think he was an influence on on your generation of artists, like Gabriele Rosco, Riccardo Tevanija, Philippe Parano? Do you think there is a...
I think Boetti was an immense influence on the whole generations, I think, of the 1990s, because I think our generation, in some kind of way, Felix González Torres was a very big influence through the idea also of time. Fishley Weiss were a very big influence, but I think Boetti was an immense influence, and I think it's something which come up again and again in conversation with artists.
You had many conversations with him, but you never recorded an interview. Is it a regret? Do you think it was the start of your somehow indirectly the start of your interview project? The fact that
yeah, definitely. I mean, it's sort of, I always had this conversation with artists, and I realized at a certain moment that it's just an immense loss if they are not recorded. And then Alighiero had died, and I realized that we had all these conversations, and I could only remember parts of it. I felt it became somehow urgent to record him. Ever since, I mean, I've recorded about 2,000 hours, so that was definitely a trigger. It's the big unrealized project. This unrealized project of of having an interview with Alighiero, but nevertheless, I think it's learning from Alighiero Boetti every day.
Do you think you could consider him as the Andy Warhol of the East in a way? Or?
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the East, because somehow when I entered the art world and I started to do my first exhibitions, the art world was still very much dominated by Western art. And, it was very much, I mean, Marché Saint-Later had happened in '89, Jean-Yves Martin's exhibition, very inspired by Sultan, and Boetti was obviously part of that. And that, for the first time, really put the focus also on, non-Western art. And I think it's something which, throughout the 90s, became very, very strong. And I think Alighiero had anticipated that ever since the 60s, 70s. I mean, the One Hotel is just one of the examples of his many, many collaborations and moments of reciprocity and exchange he had with the East. And I think, in some kind of way, when one day we're going to look back to our time and think, what's really the big change? I think one of the things is, in a sort of Fernand Braudellian way, if you think about the long duration, what changed, in the long duration, is definitely this shift. Now that we have an incredibly emerging art scenes in the East, in China, in India, in the Middle East, all over Asia. And I think that's something Boetti clearly anticipated. He clearly anticipated very much, and he very often said that. I mean, in conversations he had very often said, you cannot just be as a curator in the Western world and have this limited view only on the Western world. He said, the world is a polyphony, and I think this whole idea of an archipelago, it leads us back also again to Edouard Glissant, the idea of the world as an archipelago, the idea of the 21st century as a sort of a polyphony of centers, no longer being, I mean, Paris lost the avant-garde to New York, but then it led to a polyphony of centers. There is no longer this quest for one center, we have a polyphony of centers. And I think Boetti's whole work anticipated that. And I think the more time advances, the more we see how much he has been in a state of presentment. He presented and anticipated our time as a true pioneer. And I was also thinking, I mean, many things have to do with invention of new formats and also invention of new rules of the game. And I think very often, if you think about Oulipo, as a whole literature movement, we could also, I think it's interesting to talk about Boetti and Oulipo also. I mean, this whole Oulipo obsession for lists and the Oulipo obsession for new rules of the game is something we find very strongly in the work of Alighiero Boetti. And I think this idea, not only the invention of new rules of the game, but also the invention of new formats is something which for me has always been very present as a curator and has been highly encouraged by him. And inspired by him. And I also think, I mean, if that at a certain moment was extended from the exhibition to other formats, I mean, for example, when in 2005 we started in Stuttgart the marathon, I again had Boetti on my mind. I was thinking, we started with this 12 hours and 24 hours kind of don't stop event. I was again thinking, Boetti said we need to push the boundaries. We need to go into new rules of the game. So I think it's something which has always been there. I mean, I think this first meeting with him, I think there are these encounters which really are life-changing, and that's somehow what happened. Yeah, learning from Alighiero Boetti. I mean, when Turisca Brown said, learning from Las Vegas, so we could say learning from Alighiero and Boetti.
Alighiero Boetti. Excellent. Thank you very much, Nicola.
Pleasure to talk to you.